Good morning, beloved. Peace be with you. Well, we just jumped 4 chapters from yesterday, from John 17 to John 21. This should be a pretty familiar passage for us, though. It's one of the resurrection appearances that Jesus has with some of the disciples, especially Peter and John. And we it's typically talked about as far as the connected with Peter's threefold denial of Jesus. He denied him 3 times, and so here's 3 times Jesus makes him kind of repair that damage by expressing his love for him. But it's even more than that. We can look at this even from a spiritual, just kind of a spiritual interpretation and connect it with the spiritual life and growth in the spiritual life, or growth, what we would say in spiritual maturity. So we want to look at that a little bit, because that's how it really will connect with each one of us. So first, just to refresh some of the underlying question and answer back and forth between Jesus and Peter. We know here, we hear one word, love. But we have said many times, there's different types of love, and the Greek language has a different word for each type of love. So if we were to reread some of this with those more precise translations, we would see a little more of what's going on and why Peter gets upset. So Jesus says, "Simon, son of John, do you agape me more than these? Do you love me unconditionally and totally and completely more than these other disciples here?" So remember, we've said many times, every time in the New Testament that God talks about his love for us, the love he wants from us to him, the love he wants for us to each other, is always agape love. Nothing less. So even if you don't know any Greek and don't have any Greek, whatever, anytime you hear Jesus or God say anything about love, the love he wants for us or has for us or wants us to have for each other, it's agape love and nothing less. So he asks him, knowing that pattern in Jesus' life, you know right away that Jesus is always saying, "Peter, do you agape me? Do you love me totally, completely, unconditionally, no strings attached, holding nothing back?" How many of us can say yes to that? And Peter answers him and says, "Yes. Yes, Lord, you know that I love you like a brother." Different love. You know I have fraternal love for you. Jesus says, "Okay. Feed my lambs." Again, a second time, he says, "Simon, son of John, do you agape me? Do you love me unconditionally, totally, completely, no strings attached? Do you hold nothing back? Do you love me that much?" And Simon says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you like a brother. I've got fraternal love for you." He says, "Tend my sheep." And a third time, he says, "Now, Simon, son of John, do you love me like a brother? Do you even have fraternal love for me?" And now Peter gets distressed. And he just says, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you like a brother, and that's it. That's all I got." So he says to him, "Feed my sheep." Now we can connect it with growth in spiritual maturity, because what he says next, it's not just about what kind of death Peter's going to have to go through, but look at there's 2 differences here. When you were younger, you used to dress yourself and go where you wanted, but when you grow old, someone else will dress you and you will go where you do not want to go. Now, this is in the spiritual life. Even when we're a brand new Christian, even when we're just spiritually immature, when we're still spiritual infants or spiritual adolescents, when we're not spiritual adults yet, we still dress ourselves and go where we want to go. We are ruled by our will, not God's will. You're spiritual and you're a Christian, but you're immature. because you're not being ruled by the Spirit of God. You're still being ruled by what you want to do. This is something only you and I have to do our little self-checkups. One of the ways I see it is people will come up and get all excited. Father, I want to volunteer and help out. What do you need help with? Whatever you need help with, I'll do it, whatever it is. Okay, well, I need help over here. Well, I don't want to do that, though. What else do you got? Well, I thought you said whatever. No, you see, the spiritual immaturity comes out because it's really about their will, what they want to do, how they want to help. See, it's not total, complete, unconditional, self-sacrificial love. So that's how we measure. Where am I in my spiritual maturity? And to the extent that I'm still making the decisions and I'm making the choices and I'm doing what I want to do, where I get something out of this, then I'm still in spiritual infant or at best a spiritual adolescent. But I'm not yet a spiritual adult. One of the answers here that Jesus gives them from he says, when you grow old, when you actually get to spiritual maturity, you won't dress yourself and you won't go where you want to go. You'll go to the uncomfortable places. You'll go talk to somebody off the streets at the Starbucks. It doesn't matter if you know them. You won't care. You might care, but you'll ignore it about how they're going to respond to you. If they think you're crazy, if they're going to persecute you, you'll go because the Holy Spirit has asked you to go and talk to somebody about Jesus. It's not about what you want anymore. It's about what the Holy Spirit wants. The Spirit of Christ in you and I leading us to accomplish His mission. That's how you tell a difference. Young, old, spiritually immature, spiritually mature. Now this is the answer. How we grow in spiritual maturity. It's parallel to growth in physical, or we could say, not even physical maturity, but personal character growth. Because if I just eat food, my body's going to grow, and I'll look like a man, but I could still act like a boy. So for me to get from my character, from my inside, my personhood to grow in maturity, you need responsibility. Right? This is how kids grow up, not just physically, but mentally, intellectually, how you grow their character, their moral life, how you grow their personhood. You give them responsibility. You start out with chores, help them to be responsible for things that outside themselves. If you and I are only responsible for ourselves, well, then we stay self-centered. And it's all about the self, because this is all I'm responsible for. But you have to give people things where they're responsible for things or people outside themselves. And then they stop being self-centered and they get other-centered, because somebody's depending on them. And it starts with chores, and it starts with other responsibilities around the house. Then they got to get a job, hopefully one day, and you just keep increasing the responsibility as they are growing in maturity. And boy, pretty soon you get married, and now you're responsible for a spouse, and then all of a sudden kids come around and they let you know you're responsible for me and I'm hungry. Right? They're pulling you out of yourself, and it forces you to become mature. Well, parallel all that with the spiritual life. To grow in spiritual maturity, you must have spiritual responsibility. You must become spiritually responsible for something or someone else. This is where it ties right in with the basic method of discipleship. First, you and I get discipled, and somebody is feeding us and nourishing us and helping us grow. But very quickly after that, you and I should be discipling somebody else. So we're responsible for their growth. As soon as you learn how to pray, teach somebody else how to pray and walk with them and become responsible for them spiritually. And you can apply this to every different type of ministry you like. Let's say you like feeding the homeless. Okay, it's wonderful for people to show up and feed the homeless. But that actually will not really help you grow in spiritual maturity. You might feel good about yourself. But you see, then it's all still about yourself. Now, if you want to grow in spiritual maturity through feeding the homeless or some ministry like that, you've got to become responsible for feeding the homeless, which means you've got to commit. I will commit to feeding 10 homeless people every month. That means I will pay for 10 meals. I will make sure I pack up 10 meals. I will make sure I hand out 10 meals. And if I don't show up that day, that means 10 people don't get fed. Because I'm responsible for feeding those 10 people. Oh, see, now that's a little different than just showing up, packing up the food that somebody else paid for, and then handing it out to them, right? Now you're responsible. If you don't show up, they don't eat. That's when you grow in maturity. When somebody's depending on you, and if you don't show up, they don't eat. Look at what Jesus says. Feed my lambs. Peter, if you don't show up, they're not going to get fed. You've got to teach them. You've got to train them. You've got to lead them in this way of life that I've taught you, Peter. Tend my sheep. You've got to guard them. You've got to protect them. You've got to lay down your life for them at times. If you don't do it, they're going to experience harm. See, you and I become responsible where if we don't show up, somebody goes hungry, physically, spiritually, whatever. So to grow in spiritual maturity, you and I have to take on spiritual responsibility. You've got to become responsible for a ministry, responsible for teaching, leading, guiding, discipling. You've got to be responsible for somebody else's spiritual growth. If you're not doing this, I'm sorry, you might be doing a lot, but the truth is you're not growing because it's a principle of life. You and I cannot grow into maturity without responsibility, whether it's physical maturity, spiritual maturity, moral character maturity. It's just a principle of life. So, who are you feeding spiritually? Who are you tending spiritually? And a third time, Jesus says, feed my sheep. Who are you feeding spiritually? Where if you don't show up, somebody spiritually goes hungry. If you don't have that in your life, you're not advancing. You're not growing. Your love's not growing. Your spirit's not growing. You're not growing. That means you're immature and you're not helping the body. At some point, you got to get off the bottle and start eating solid food. And then at some point, you got to feed yourself with your fingers or your utensils. And then at some point, you're going to have to feed somebody else. Quick story again. George Mueller. Go look up George Mueller. He wanted to show that God will take care of all of our needs, and you don't even have to ask people. You just have to ask him. And so and to prove it, he said, and God will take care of whatever my needs are. Not what I want, but what my needs are. And our needs include whoever or whatever we're responsible for. So if you have kids, your needs include not just feeding yourself, but feeding your kids. God's got to provide for you and for your kids to eat. And so George Mueller said, you know what? He started off small. Lord, not only do I need to eat every day, but I am going to take on the responsibility of 10 orphans. I'm going to feed 10 orphans every day. That means I need food and those 10 kids need food because they're my responsibility now. And you know what? Every day, money began to show up in his mailbox or on his doorstep for the 10 orphans. And then he said, Lord, I'm going to take responsibility for 50 now. And then the money showed up for 50. And he just kept growing it. And all of a sudden he has a huge orphanage. He's saying he is responsible for feeding thousands of orphans that were all over. And money kept showing up. It will be the last minute. But you see, he said, Lord, I'm taking on this responsibility for these kids. So now these are my needs. They're my needs. And the Lord provided for all of his needs. Not easy, very stressful, but that's how he began to increase responsibility. So if those needs weren't met, people didn't eat. That's real responsibility. That's real growth and maturity. That's what we have to have. We've got to have mature Christians running around, because the world is starving. The world is starving for Christ. And the only reason it gets worse is because we're not feeding them. Because we haven't taken them on as a responsibility yet. Who are you going to feed today and take responsibility for today?